Is it real, or is it just another tool for politics by a religion? We're going to talk about this and other issues about the future of New York City. Will religious faiths divide us, or will they unite us? Muslim Jews and Christians are gathering outside a mosque to show solidarity against attacks on Muslims. We don't want a New Zealand-style attack to happen here in our own city. We also have everyday problems of living together. Right now, there is a controversy over whether Muslim women who wear a head covering should have to take them off to be photographed if arrested by the police. Are we doomed to division and anger and hate and violence? Today we have a man who calms the waters, stands up against hate, and is widely admired, Shaykh T.A. Bashir. Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religion, Shaykh.
Thank you for your invitation, and I'm happy to be here to clear up some of the misinformation that abounds throughout the media in reference to Islam.
Now, you are a Muslim yourself, correct?
Yes.
And did you grow up as a Muslim?
I grew up as a Muslim. I heard Malcolm X speak on 125th Street.
Wow.
And since then, I started studying the religion. I studied with Minister Donald, who ran a program for young boys who didn't have fathers. And that program required us to do certain readings, J.A. Rogers, Superman the Man, and other historical books in reference to Africa, in reference to the so-called North America slave trade, where the enslavement of many African Americans led to the state that we're in today.
Now, you eventually became active in leading several Muslim organizations. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Well, currently I'm with the Westchester Coalition Against Islamophobia.
Oh, they're the ones that put on events in Westchester about that issue.
Exactly.
Can you tell us about an example of one of those?
Well, we plan to have one the last day of the month of March, 7 Saxon Road, and we're going to have Munera there, the iconic sister who wears a hijab that's made up like the American flag.
You know, have you followed this controversy that happened earlier this year between the two women, Jamila Clark and Arwa Aziz, who objected to the fact that they had to remove their hijab, their head covering, to be able to take photos because they had been picked up to the police by some minor violation. And they said this was made them feel really, really uncomfortable. Are you familiar with this?
I'm familiar with the case, and we look at that as another trajectory of Islamophobia. Not only Muslim women, but Christian women and Jewish women initially wore head coverings as a sign of respect.
That's what
God.
That's what a hijab is. It's a
Right.
head covering to show a sign of
scarf.
respect.
Yes, yes. And it's a sign of respect. And women wear it for different reasons. Some wear it for religious reasons, some wear it as an article of clothing, whatever. I just want to point out that they've been doing this for years, but all of a sudden, this has become a point of focus for Islamophobia. Why are you wearing this? And asking a woman to remove her hijab is almost like asking her to disrobe because it's part of their clothing attire.
Now, you have referred several times to this idea of Islamophobia. And I'm wondering, is it a real thing, or is it just a political ploy to gain power in the politics of today?
Well, it's real in the sense that Muslim communities are facing tremendous discrimination, hate, and physical violence because of their religion. Where I dispute with the term is that Islamophobia is a new way of talking about these same kinds of hate incidents, right? Physical violence that happened hundreds of years ago in America that we don't speak up, because what has happened is that African American Muslims have been excluded from the conversation because the term Islamophobia is generally referring to immigrant Muslims who just got here and are confronting this kind of hate.
So what you're saying is that the idea that there's a phobia arises because some new group comes in is not completely the right story.
No, it's not.
It's really about the practice of discrimination and prejudice, hate against some group of people, often African Americans in the past, now African Americans who also may be identified as Muslims, but by sort of shifting the focus, you can sort of forget about racism and talk about the new thing,
Right.
which is Islamophobia, and it ends up, can be, a sort of a subtle sort of race dividing term. Is that what you're saying?
It's race dividing, it's gender dividing, you know.
How is it gender dividing?
It's gender dividing because if you look at Islamophobia, the major tropes for genders is that the Muslim man is a violent, irrational, bloodthirsty person, you know, that wants to blow himself up, kill everybody in the pizza stand, so forth and so on. When you look at the media, you'll see this theme is repeated over and over. Then when you look at the Muslim woman, she's forced to put this thing on her head, because if she doesn't, the Muslim man is going to, you know, beat her up or whatever. She's usually depicted in a slovenly kind of way, you know. She has no rights, you know. Her husband may give her a Mercedes-Benz, but she's not allowed to drive up and down the street. There's a number of projections or narratives that are based on what gender the Muslim are, and all of them are negative. Did you see the film Argo?
Yeah, I vaguely remember it.
Okay. All the bad Muslims had beards, straggly beards and stuff like that. All the good Muslims were dressed in modern conservative clothes. They were drinking, you know. The women had skirts on that didn't come down to their ankle. That's their choice. But what the message was in that movie was that the good Muslims were, you know, westernized. And the Muslims that wanted to cause confusion, you know, appeared to be someone from the 7th century in terms of dress, attitude, cultural, so forth and so on.
You know, there was an example of that. The State Department decided they would do outreach to Muslims in the Middle East, which got translated as outreach to the Muslims that are most secular, most westernized.
Right.
So consequently, they wondered, well, how come we end up, the Muslim public didn't follow our efforts, because we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on it.
Right.
Just because they didn't talk to the, we would call them more conservative Muslims.
Exactly.
They didn't talk to them. The question is, are conservative Muslims, that means observant Muslims,
Mm-hmm.
are they all intolerant and violent? No. You tell me how you would respond to that.
We have to look at what's happening with extremists, not just Muslims, but also the extremists in America that's running around killing up huge amounts of people that the press doesn't really follow up on. But if a Muslim does something, you know, we get books, articles, you know, TV interviews and
You become
whatnot.
the studied problem.
Right. And so what happens is that conservative Muslims are not really more religious than any other Muslim. They may follow a very limited interpretation of the text, whereas other Muslims are willing to meet and operate in what we would call a pluralistic sense. They have the same outlook and the same aspirations as other people. They want to, go to work, provide for their family, send their children to schools and colleges that other people go to, and things of that nature.
So instead of using the word Islamophobia, which of course becomes a shorthand, and maybe you have to use it, but what word would you prefer to use?
Well, if we look at phobia from the sense of Sigmund Freud, the great psychologist and psychiatrist, a phobia is an unrealistic fear of something.
Right.
A person has a phobic reaction to the sight of a dog. So if a dog is 10 blocks down 2nd Avenue, they're already having an anxiety attack or something. So it's basically an unreal fear. What do we do with that fear? Now, Islamophobia also includes the fact that there are certain behaviors that are engaged in to lessen that fear or to increase a sense of self in face of that, because there's religious intolerance there. And there was a book written like in 1954 by Gordon Allport. The name of the book was Prejudice. It's still a classic among psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, clinical workers of that ilk.
Right.
And one of the things that he stated, he drew a pyramid. And on the bottom of the pyramid was hateful language and speech. And then as he ascended that pyramid, he got to the apex. And at the apex, it was, killing, slaughter, so forth and so on. And we're seeing this happening now. Let's say Afghanistan has a problem, right? The solution, according to Americans, is let's kill these people and we will have a successful resolution of that problem.
Well, I know that the Pew Center has done some surveys of Americans, and they indicate that Americans have some, maybe a majority of Americans have some issues with Muslims. For example, 41%, not a majority, but a big portion, say Muslims are committed to violence.
Muslim men, yeah.
Right.
I read that report.
Also, the 70-some-odd%, of a very large portion, say Muslims are liable to be against democracy. How do you respond to those? Are they irrational phobias? Or are they well-founded because they see what happens in Muslim lands and say, oh, maybe that might happen here? How would you respond to that? And how would you say, wait a moment, tell us a little bit about what you
First of all, there were a number of studies in Christian churches, right, that asked how many Christians knew about the Islamic religion.
Right.
And it was an astounding 80, I believe it was over 80, but it was at least 80% of the people didn't know anything about the Muslim religion. They didn't know that we follow Abraham, right? And they had no knowledge of what Islam was about. They had basically what was fed to them by the media, and those were false reports, because many of the media is intensely ignorant of what Islam is and what Islamic people, Muslims, are about on an everyday level. What they did is they took the views of the extremists and projected that as what all Muslims believe. Most Muslims reject extremism, just like most Christians do and most Jews do. So that is a false report, and that's one of the things that we try to do as Muslims now, is to try to interact interfaithfully and also teach and preach as we go along to our brothers and sisters in others' faith.
You think that the solution then is interaction and teaching, or are there other things we need to be doing?
There are other things that we need to be doing, but I believe that a great start is by inviting people in and letting them see, Muslims in an everyday situation. People who work with Muslims, people who belong to civic and social organizations with Muslims, people who know Muslims usually say, I reject that because I know Muslims, and that's not true. We have to distinguish what is Islam and what is extremism. Just like if Timothy McVeigh, he was a Catholic, right? He blew up a building, he killed 163 people. I didn't see anybody acting out on Catholics or blowing up Catholic churches or assassinating Catholic leaders and whatnot. It was accepted. They said Timothy McVeigh, he has a problem. He's a nut. So we're going to dismiss that. That's not the way Catholic people interact,
Well, I remember, you remember the mosque controversy in 2010.
Oh, do I?
Well, we had Journey Through NYC Religion had just gotten started in July of 2010. And we noticed that we had been traveling through the city, visiting masjids, mosques across the city. Mm-hmm. And we noticed that all of the media and the police and government officials and scholars were using the number that there were 99 mosques in New York City. And we thought to ourselves, says we've already been to 145 mosques.
Right.
What? That's a pretty big mistake, because and they were using old figures and they'd never gone out. We had gone out and visited them, so we did over a dozen articles on who are the Muslims of New York.
Right.
And we started to see a little bit of shift in the coverage, because our other media, other scholars said, oh, there are that many? And of course, a couple of years later, we had visited 275 mosques.
Okay.
And now we would estimate there are probably around 300 mosques.
Right.
Now, that may make some people anxious, but it may also show that Muslims are saying, we want to be part of American society. We're here to stay, and we're going to build in neighborhoods and say, we're here. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, why is there this big increase in Muslims in New York City?
Well, about 30 to 40% of Muslims are African Americans that are not counted for whatever reason. I got my suspicions, but that's for another show.
Well, we count them, I guarantee.
Yeah, okay. But officially, African Americans very rarely are invited to the discussion.
Right.
If something happens, you'll usually see immigrant Muslims addressing this, the situation. A bomb went off, this happened. Even when the World Trade Center was bombed, my mother was alive then, she lived there. No one said to me, how do you feel about this? It wasn't about, was it somebody from Saudi Arabia or anything like that. As a Vietnam veteran who spent 2 years in Vietnam, I felt personally affronted by why don't you bomb your own despotic government instead of coming over here, That's the attitude I had. So there's a growing consciousness in terms of Muslims to address areas of concerns that they have. And the other thing is that many of the newer mosques are masjids by women, addressing their issues and giving them an opportunity to talk about the things
here
that are
in
important.
New York?
Yes. I have a friend who is putting on a panel discussion. Ironically, it's in a Christian church up in Westchester, and they want to talk about the issues that affect women predominantly. And this is not only happening in Islam, it's also happening in Judaism, it's also happening in Christianity, because for one reason, people's interpretation have shut out women or the other per se, you know.
You yourself have been have a history of dealing with Muslims who often became to Islamic faith in prison, and get out, and then they have all of this anger and violence stored up, and they have a hard time dealing within their families. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in that area? Because it's really very significant. I've met some of the men that you've dealt with,
Yes.
who are really admirable. And so you help them get from a bad place to a good place. Tell us a little bit about those efforts.
You know what happens with that, Tony? A lot of that is based on faulty interpretation. You know, if you interpret the Quran from the 7th century Hijaz, you know, flat out literally,
Yeah.
then the Quran is out of place. But if you're able to incorporate, because the Quran is very flexible, people try to make it, you know, this thing where there's no flexibility and you must do this and you must do that and things of that nature. This is why we have a secondary source of authority that sometimes elaborate or provide insight on what is going
You
on
mean
in the Quran.
these are called the Hadith, or you're
The Hadith, yes, the Sunnah.
And so you educate them that there is interpretations that they have missed,
Right.
but they're when they come into the family, they're sort of living out sort of a 7th century understanding of man-woman
7th century.
relationship.
In prison, a lot of people, even Malcolm X, right, learned Islam in the prison.
Right.
But there's a transition when you go from one environment to the other environment. And what we try to do is help build a bridge from that. In prison, you have to think a certain way because you're really oppressed, right?
Right.
When you come out here, you have to expand on that a little bit and, you know, think a little bit more wiser with a little bit more hikmah or wisdom, as we say, because you're in the bigger yard now. You left the little yard to go to the bigger yard. So I understand what's going on with a lot of people in general that's in prison because it's a inhumane environment, and people come out angry. And their anger is justified because they're treated like dogs, just like the little kids you see in those dog pens. What kind of person's gonna come out of there, you know? Right. We have to think about, right now we're thinking about getting them out, but they're gonna need some kind of treatment because they're separated from their parents, this, that, and the other. New York prison system separates people from their family. That's one strike against many of the people that's in prison. They don't get to see their family, their children, their wives, so forth and so on.
Often they are sent to upstate prisons,
Right.
which means you could have to take a bus, all-day trip
Right.
at the best.
And get a hotel room so you could visit the next day.
So it really isolates.
Yeah. It's the criminal, the prison system is one of the most inhumane systems that one American can do to another American, short of just shooting them.
But when they come out and you tell them, well, you need to get some better teaching, do they respond to that and they say, oh, Shaykh, yeah, we're ready to go? Or do they say, who are you?
Well, you know, everybody is questioned in terms of their authority or their credentials. And to me, that's a good thing. You know, ask me a question. And most of the brothers that I know, like Mikhail DeVoe, who you know, that started the program for people returning back from in getting involved. He calls it reentry into civilian life and whatnot. I don't blame them. They have to question because of the environment that they came from, where everything you have to think more than once about it.
Whether it's a game or not.
Right, because people lie, and there's things that are done in prison that you won't find in the so-called society, you know, where they say word is bond. This is a statement that many people say, but that's not the case in prison. Word is jive.
Yeah, but I know that you've had some success. I've met some of the guys that you've talked to. Do you counsel, or do you do it mainly through teaching?
Basically, I find out what's going on with the person, right?
Okay.
The person could be a man, the person could be a woman, and that's a whole nother story what women go through, because it's horrific as what men go through. It is even worse for women, you know. They're deprived of sanitary equipment as a punitive action.
So you sort of tailor what you do with them according to their needs.
And what they say to me. They have to tell me what they need.
You know, before we end up here,
Okay.
and we've covered a lot of ground, but there's one last thing. It's a big issue,
Okay.
but as you know, there's an opioid crisis that have hit our neighborhoods. Do you run across among Muslims that you deal with that they're struggling with this type of curse?
Yeah, Muslims are not, they don't have a shield or something that protects them from what's going on in the society.
Sure.
Even though I must say that all the imams that I know and other leaders speak out against that. This opioid crisis had just hit the white neighborhood. It was already a problem in the black neighborhood, and many people died, went to jail for life because of it, you know? So,
you know, Shaykh, we're very glad we could make today.
it's been my pleasure.
And audience, thank you for tuning in to A Journey Through NYC Religion Television. We hope to see you at our next show.